A very particular kind of anxiety begins long before anyone around you notices it. On the outside, it can look small. A message sent, a question asked, a second opinion requested, a quick need for confirmation before you make a decision, before you relax, before you trust what you already feel. Nothing about it seems dramatic at first. In fact, it can look almost harmless. You ask, "Do you think that was okay? Did I do the right thing? Are you sure everything is fine? Does this sound normal to you?" And for a moment, the answer helps. You feel relief. The pressure eases. Your body softens a little. Your thoughts slow down. It seems like the problem has been solved. But then something unsettling happens. The calm does not stay. The doubt comes back. Sometimes within minutes. Sometimes later that day. Sometimes the next morning, in a slightly different shape, but carrying the same demand. You need to hear it again. Or hear it from someone else. Or ask it in a new way, hoping this version of the answer will go deeper than the last one. That is when the pattern begins to reveal itself. The problem is not that you never receive reassurance. The problem is that reassurance never fully holds. This creates a very specific kind of inner exhaustion, because one part of you knows how irrational it may look from the outside. You know you just asked. You know someone already answered. You know the logical issue should be settled. And yet the need rises again anyway, almost as if the first answer never truly reached the place in you that was asking. That split can feel humiliating. You may tell yourself that you should be stronger than this, that you're being too much, too unsure, too dependent, too emotionally fragile. But those judgments rarely solve anything, because the need for reassurance is not usually a simple lack of logic. It is a pattern of regulation, a way the psyche tries to steady itself when it does not trust its own inner ground. This often shows up in ordinary parts of life. You make a decision, then immediately need to hear that it was reasonable. You send a message, then feel an urge to ask someone whether it sounded wrong. You leave a conversation and replay your tone, your words, your expression, looking for some hidden mistake, and before long you want someone else to tell you that you did not ruin anything. Or perhaps it happens in relationships. Someone is a little quieter than usual, and your mind begins building interpretations. Rather than sitting with the uncertainty, you feel an almost immediate need to ask, "Are we okay?" If the answer is yes, there may be relief for a moment. But if your inner structure is not changed, the relief often dissolves quickly. Then you are back inside the same field of doubt, needing another confirmation, another sign, another stabilizing response from the outside. This is what makes reassurance so deceptive. It feels like the solution, but often it only interrupts the anxiety without transforming it. And because it interrupts the anxiety, the psyche learns to depend on it. That dependence can become subtle and constant. You may begin consulting others before trusting your own reactions, before trusting your own perceptions, before trusting your own decisions. Not because you have no intelligence, not because you cannot think clearly, but because thought itself no longer feels sufficient unless it is backed by another mind. That is a painful place to live from, because it means certainty is always just outside you, just one message away, one answer away, one comforting voice away. And if that outside voice is not available, the mind begins to spiral. You may become restless, unable to settle, unable to move on, unable to feel complete inside your own experience until someone else helps close the loop. At first, this can remain almost invisible because it is socially acceptable in many forms. People ask for advice. People seek support. People want perspective. None of that is inherently unhealthy. Human beings need reflection. We regulate through relationship. We look to others for help clarifying reality all the time. The problem is not the existence of reassurance. The problem is what happens when reassurance becomes a substitute for inner authority. That is the shift you may be feeling. You no longer ask because it adds something meaningful. You ask because without it, something inside you cannot settle. This can create a strange kind of dependency in relationships. Not always dramatic dependency. Sometimes a very subtle one. You begin to rely on certain people not only for closeness, but for emotional stabilization. Their tone calms you. Their certainty soothes you. Their responses become the place where your mind goes to recover from uncertainty. And over time, this changes a whole emotional structure of the relationship. You are no longer only relating to them as a person. You are relating to them as a source of temporary inner regulation. That can be hard to admit because it does not feel manipulative. It feels necessary. And sometimes it feels loving. After all, is it not normal to want comfort from the people close to you? Of course it is. That is not the issue. The issue is a repetition, the inability for reassurance to remain inside you once it has been given, the way certainty slips away almost as soon as it arrives, the way comfort becomes something you must keep reborrowing. That repetition tells you something important. The outside answer is reaching you, but not transforming the place where the anxiety is rooted. This is why the pattern can feel so hopeless after a while. You may already know what people will say. You may already know the likely answer to your question, and still you feel compelled to ask. That compulsion can create shame, especially if you are self-aware. You may notice yourself doing it in real time and still feel unable to stop. You know the reassurance will only work temporarily. You know the doubt will probably return. You know the loop is repeating. And yet, when the discomfort rises strongly enough, the urge to ask can feel more powerful than your understanding of the pattern. That is often the sign that something deeper is involved. Not just worry, not just indecision. Something more structural. You may also notice how much reassurance-seeking affects your inner relationship to your own mind. Over time, self-trust weakens. Why? Because every time you bypass your own perception in search of external certainty, you reinforce the idea that your inner world cannot be trusted to hold you. Your intuition, your discernment, your emotional reading of a situation, even your moral judgments start feeling less solid unless someone else confirms them. This can make even small decisions feel disproportionately loaded. You do not simply ask, "What do I think?" You ask, "Can I trust what I think without someone else helping me trust it?" That second question is much more painful because it reveals that the issue is not only anxiety about a situation. It is anxiety about your own ability to stand inside yourself without immediate external support. You may see this most clearly when reassurance is unavailable, when the person does not answer quickly, when no one is around, when you have to sit alone with uncertainty for longer than you want to. That is often when the pattern becomes fully visible. The mind becomes louder. The emotions become more intense. You may feel almost abandoned by the absence of an answer, even if no one has actually done anything wrong. The gap between your inner instability and the missing outside confirmation becomes almost unbearable. That is why this pattern is not trivial. It is not mere insecurity in the casual sense. It is an entire way of surviving uncertainty, a way of borrowing steadiness from outside voices, because something in you still does not believe your own inner voice can do the job alone. And once you start seeing that clearly, the question changes. It is no longer only, "Why do I keep asking?" It becomes, "What is so difficult about standing in uncertainty without borrowing someone else's certainty to survive it?" That is where the real work begins. Because once you arrive at that question, you are no longer dealing only with reassurance as behavior. You are beginning to confront the structure of self-trust beneath it. What makes reassurance-seeking so powerful is that it is rarely about the immediate question alone. The question may sound simple. Did I do the right thing? Are they upset with me? Does this make sense? Am I overreacting? But underneath the question, there is often another need entirely. The need to be steadied, to be held together, to borrow certainty from outside because certainty no longer feels available enough inside. That is where the deeper psychology begins. Carl Jung would not reduce this pattern to mere insecurity or indecisiveness. He would ask what psychic arrangement has formed such that the ego cannot remain with uncertainty without immediately seeking external structure. He would want to know what part of the psyche has become underdeveloped, what complexes have gathered around doubt, and why outside voices have been given so much authority over inner experience. At the center of this is the ego's relationship to authority. Jung understood that the ego, especially in its less differentiated form, often seeks order through external structures. Those structures can be institutions, beliefs, roles, values, or people. In each case, something outside the self is unconsciously treated as more stable, more trustworthy, or more legitimate than what is arising from within. This can be necessary in early development. A child needs guidance from outside. The ego does not emerge fully formed, fully grounded, fully capable of containing uncertainty on its own. It learns orientation through relationship. It learns what is real, what is safe, what matters, and how to regulate emotional states partly through the nervous systems, attitudes, and responses of others. But if that process is marked by inconsistency, emotional volatility, chronic self-doubt, or fear of making mistakes, the developing psyche may never fully internalize a stable sense of inner authority. Instead, it learns something else. Certainty lives outside me. In that case, reassurance-seeking is not simply a bad habit. It is a continuation of a deeper arrangement in which the outer world is still being asked to do a job the inner world has not yet learned to do. This is why the relief from reassurance feels so immediate. For a moment, the outside voice becomes structure. It tells you what to feel, what to believe, how to orient yourself. The anxiety subsides not because the uncertainty has been fully metabolized, but because another mind has temporarily organized your experience for you. That temporary organization can feel almost life-saving, which is precisely why it becomes so compelling. Jung would likely see this as a problem of psychic center. When the ego is not in a stable enough relationship to its own inner authority, it reaches outward compulsively. It searches for a container, a witness, a judge, a calm voice, someone who seems more grounded than you feel. The psyche assumes that if another person can name the situation clearly enough, then your internal chaos will finally stop. Sometimes this works for a moment, but only for a moment. Why? Because the borrowed certainty does not become your own simply because you hear it. It does not automatically integrate. The words land, the nervous system softens, but the deeper structure remains unchanged. Soon the anxiety rises again, because the inner ground itself is not yet strengthened. That is why reassurance can become cyclical. Not because the people around you are giving bad answers, but because no answer can permanently replace an undeveloped inner function. The psyche keeps seeking from the outside what it has not yet built enough of inside. This is also where complexes begin to matter. If uncertainty is linked in your psyche with shame, punishment, abandonment, conflict, or emotional chaos, then not knowing becomes charged far beyond its actual importance. A small ambiguity can activate a much larger inner storm. The question is no longer simply unresolved. It becomes emotionally dangerous. When that happens, the mind cannot tolerate the gap. It wants closure immediately. And because the self does not feel stable enough to provide that closure internally, it reaches outward. A trusted friend, a partner, a parent figure, an authority figure, sometimes multiple people in sequence. The psyche behaves as if the answer must be found somewhere outside the self, because remaining alone with uncertainty has become almost intolerable. This is why reassurance often travels with over-explaining. The more detail you provide, the more you hope the other person can give the exact answer that will finally settle the doubt. But the detail is not only informational. It is an attempt to engineer certainty, to build enough context that the outer voice can become a perfectly reliable guide. And still, even when the guide responds, something remains unmet, because the unmet need is not always informational. It is structural. There is another Jungian layer here that matters deeply: projection. When you cannot trust your own inner center, you often project authority outward. The quality you lack inwardly becomes attributed to another person. They become the one who knows, the one who sees clearly, the one who can hold what you cannot hold, the one whose confidence feels more real than yours. This projection can happen very subtly. You may begin idealizing certain people not because they are actually omniscient, but because your psyche needs them to stand in for missing inner stability. Their reassurance then feels uniquely soothing because it is not only their opinion you are receiving in projected form the certainty you have not yet claimed within yourself. Jung would say that what is projected always carries psychic energy. That is why these people can become so emotionally central. Their silence destabilizes you. Their reassurance calms you. Their confusion confuses you more. Their certainty becomes a kind of temporary inner architecture. But projections are unstable by nature. No human being can permanently carry your center for you. Sooner or later, the same person who soothed you will disappoint you, tire, become unavailable, or reveal their limits. And then the old panic returns, often even stronger, because the borrowed structure has collapsed again. This can create a painful cycle in relationships. You seek comfort, you feel relief, then dependence grows. Then anxiety about the dependence appears. Then resentment, shame, or fear being too much starts mixing with the need itself. The whole relational field becomes charged, not because reassurance is wrong in itself, but because it is being used to compensate for something deeper. Jung's language for the deeper movement would likely point toward individuation. Individuation requires that the ego develop a more conscious relationship to the self, the larger organizing center of the psyche. This does not mean becoming isolated or never needing anyone. It means the ego gradually stops treating every moment of uncertainty as a crisis requiring outside rescue. It learns to remain in contact with what arises without immediately displacing authority outward. That is very different from mere independence. It is an inner recentering, a shift from tell me what this means so I can calm down to let me stay with what this evokes and discover whether I can survive the not knowing without abandoning myself. This is difficult because uncertainty often carries more than uncertainty. It carries old fear, old helplessness, old internal chaos, old experiences where not knowing what someone felt, what was safe, or what would happen next actually did have painful consequences. So the current need for reassurance is often layered. The present situation may be mild. The emotional charge belongs to a much older field. That is why simply telling yourself to stop asking rarely works. The pattern is not purely conscious. Something in the psyche genuinely experiences uncertainty as destabilizing and reassurance as temporary rescue. Jung would not shame that. He would want to bring it into awareness. Because once you see that your reassurance-seeking is really a search for borrowed inner structure, the pattern becomes interpretable. You stop treating yourself as irrational in the simple sense. You begin understanding that the question is not, why am I so needy, but rather, why does uncertainty collapse my contact with myself so quickly? That is a much more compassionate and much more useful question. It also opens the door to something important, distinguishing support from outsourcing. Support is healthy. Human beings need reflection, mirroring, perspective, and comfort. Outsourcing happens when those things become substitutes for an inner function that the psyche has stopped trying to develop because the outer supply has become too emotionally reinforcing. The goal is not to reject support. The goal is to stop using support as the sole source of certainty. That is a much subtler task. It means learning how to hear reassurance without making it your only ground. How to receive comfort without requiring it over and over to survive your own mind. How to let another person's clarity help you without unconsciously turning their voice into a replacement for your own center. That is where the real transformation begins. Because once outside certainty is no longer unconsciously enthroned above inner perception, the ego can begin reclaiming something it projected outward. Authority, not rigid certainty, not omniscience. Authority in the deeper Jungian sense. The capacity to remain related to yourself even when nothing outside you has yet delivered the answer you want. Until that begins to form, one answer will never be enough, because the real question was never only outside. It has always been a question of whether your own psyche can become a place where uncertainty is endured without immediate self-abandonment. That is a level on which reassurance-seeking must finally be understood, not as weakness, as an unfinished relationship to inner authority. A different kind of strength begins the moment you stop asking only how to get rid of the doubt, because for a long time, that may have been the entire goal. Get the answer, get the reassurance, get the outside voice that will finally settle the nervous system and allow the mind to stop circling. That goal is understandable. When uncertainty feels unbearable, relief becomes a priority. But the problem is that relief and stability are not the same thing. Relief can be borrowed. Stability has to be built. That is the turning point of this whole pattern. You begin to understand that the issue is not merely that you ask for reassurance too often. The deeper issue is that you have not yet learned how to remain in contact with yourself while uncertainty is still alive. That is a very different task. It means the work is no longer only about changing behavior. It is about changing your relationship to the inner state that makes a behavior feel necessary. Jung would have recognized this immediately. He understood that symptoms often persist because they are trying to solve something real, even if they solve it badly. Reassurance-seeking is trying to regulate something. It is trying to create order where the ego feels unstable, to reduce psychic pressure, to stop the collapse into fear or self-doubt. If you only remove the behavior without understanding the function, the psyche simply finds another route. So integration starts with respect, not indulgence. Respect. You begin by recognizing that the part of you asking for reassurance is not foolish. It is frightened. It has learned that uncertainty is dangerous and that the fastest way to survive it is to reach for an outside anchor. That outside anchor may be a person, a message, a voice, an opinion, even a repeated search for information. Whatever form it takes, the function is the same. Reduce the inner freefall. Once you understand that, the next step becomes possible. You begin staying with the free fall for one moment longer than before. That is where the real work begins. Not by refusing all reassurance immediately, not by pretending you are already beyond the need, but by interrupting the automatic sequence. Uncertainty appears. The old panic starts. The urge to ask rises. And instead of obeying it instantly, you pause. That pause is not nothing. Psychologically, it is everything. Because in that pause, you are no longer completely fused with the pattern. You are noticing the urge rather than becoming it. You are beginning to make room between anxiety and action. At first, that room may feel almost intolerable. The body may tense. The thoughts may speed up. You may feel a pressure in your chest, a mental urgency, a sense that if you do not act quickly enough, the whole thing will spiral beyond control. This is exactly why the practice matters. You are learning to discover, in real time, what the psyche believes will happen if reassurance does not arrive immediately. That discovery is more important than the answer you were about to ask for, because maybe what you fear is not merely being wrong. Maybe you fear being alone with the wrongness. Maybe the real terror is not uncertainty itself, but the sense that without an outside voice, you will lose your center completely. If so, then the work is not only cognitive, it is relational. You are learning how to stay in relationship with yourself when no one has yet rescued you from doubt. That is a profound shift. It means that instead of rushing outward, you begin turning inward with a different question. What is happening in me right now? Not, what is the answer? But, what is being activated? Sometimes the answer is obvious. Fear, shame, a need to be reassured that you are still good, still safe, still loved, still not about to lose something important. Other times, what rises is more subtle. A collapse in confidence, a childlike helplessness, a sense that your own perception is dissolving, and another mind is required to make reality solid again. This is where Jung's insistence on consciousness becomes so important. He would not ask you to become instantly self-contained in some brittle, isolated way. He would ask you to observe the psychic movement with honesty, to become aware of what uncertainty does to your sense of self, to notice how quickly the ego disorganizes, to feel the exact place where your own perception stops feeling sufficient. When you can start naming that process, something changes, not because the anxiety vanishes, but because you are no longer only experiencing it from the inside. You are also witnessing it, and witnessing creates structure. This is one of the deepest truths in Jungian work. What becomes conscious loses some of its unconscious power. The pattern may still operate, but not in the same invisible, absolute way. So instead of reaching outward immediately, you may begin with smaller inner acts. You say to yourself, I notice that I want someone else to tell me this is okay. I notice that my mind is searching for external authority. I notice that I do not trust my own reading of the situation right now. That kind of naming is not trivial. It begins building an internal witness strong enough to remain present during uncertainty. And that witness is one of the foundations of inner authority. Over time, you can take the next step, not merely naming the urge, but staying with the discomfort without immediately resolving it. This is where tolerance begins to grow. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for not knowing. Tolerance for the fact that you may not get closure right away, and yet can remain psychologically intact. That tolerance is not built through theory. It is built through repetition, through dozens of moments where the old impulse rises, and you remain with yourself just a little longer than you used to. Maybe you wait 10 minutes before asking. Then later, 20, then perhaps in some situations, you realize you do not actually need to ask at all. Not because certainty has magically appeared, but because your capacity to contain uncertainty has grown. That growth changes your whole relationship to external reassurance. You can still receive comfort, still ask for perspective, still turn to people you trust. But the quality of the act changes. You are no longer asking from collapse. You are asking from contact. That is a major difference. Collapse says, I cannot hold this unless you hold it for me. Contact says, I am of myself in this, and I would value your perspective. One is outsourcing. The other is relationship. Jung would likely say that this is the ego slowly coming into better relation with the self. The center of gravity begins shifting inward, not into rigid self-reliance, but into a more stable inner axis. The psyche no longer assumes that uncertainty automatically means abandonment. It begins learning that confusion, anxiety, and doubt can arise without requiring immediate evacuation into someone else's mind. This also changes relationships profoundly. When reassurance is no longer a repeated emergency measure, other people become less burdened with regulating your inner world. They can comfort you without becoming the entire structure of your stability. They can support you without being unconsciously appointed as your psychic authority. That often brings more intimacy, not less, because now the relationship is less organized around crisis and more around mutuality. You are no longer using the other person mainly as an antidote to your uncertainty. You are meeting them more fully as a person. There is also a deeper confidence that starts emerging here, though it may not look like confidence in conventional sense. It is not certainty. It is not the absence of doubt. It is a growing knowledge that you can survive the gap before reassurance arrives. You can survive not knowing. You can survive the mind's search for answers without obeying instantly. You can survive your own incompleteness without needing another person to immediately stabilize it for you. That is real development. Not because you stop needing people, because you stop needing them to perform the function of an inner center. You can slowly begin inhabiting yourself. This does not happen perfectly. There will still be moments when the old impulse wins. Moments when anxiety is intense enough that you do ask. That does not erase the work. The goal is not perfection. It is a different proportion. More inner steadiness. Less automatic outsourcing. More capacity to stay. Less panic about the gap. And as that proportion changes, reassurance itself becomes cleaner. A gift, not a life support system. A form of care, not the only place where certainty can exist. Eventually, the biggest shift is this. You begin trusting that not every question must be closed immediately in order for you to remain whole. That may be the deepest transformation of all. Because once you know that, one answer no longer has to solve everything. And not having the answer right away no longer feels like the end of yourself. That is the beginning of inner authority. Not knowing less. Needing to borrow yourself less. What makes reassurance-seeking so exhausting is not only the anxiety itself. It is the way anxiety teaches you to leave yourself. Not dramatically. Not in ways other people always notice. But inwardly. Each time uncertainty rises and you immediately need another voice to calm it, something important happens. Your center shifts outward. Your peace begins depending on timing, replies, confirmation, the tone of someone else's answer, the availability of someone else's certainty. And for a moment, that can feel like relief. That is why the pattern is so powerful. It works, at least temporarily. It softens the panic, reduces the pressure, gives your mind something stable to hold. But because the stability was borrowed, it rarely lasts. The doubt returns, and with it the urge to ask again. Not because you are irrational, not because you are weak, because the deeper issue was never fully answered by the answer. Carl Jung would have recognized this as a problem of center, not the absence of intelligence, not the absence of care, the absence of enough inner authority to remain with uncertainty without immediately surrendering your psychic balance to something outside you. That is a painful thing to realize, because it means the problem is not simply the question you are asking. It is the role the question is playing. So often, reassurance is not really asking, what is true? It is asking, can you help me survive not knowing? That is much deeper. And once you understand that, the whole journey changes. You stop treating yourself like someone who simply has a bad habit of overthinking. You begin seeing the pattern more compassionately and more clearly. A frightened part of you has learned that uncertainty is intolerable unless another mind enters and organizes it. That is not a moral flaw. It is a structure, and structures can change. But they do not change through shame. They change through consciousness, through pausing long enough to see the urge before obeying it, through staying with the discomfort one moment longer than before, through noticing what the mind predicts will happen if no answer comes, through discovering gradually that uncertainty is painful but not annihilating. That is where real inner strength starts forming, not in becoming someone who never needs reflection, not in becoming emotionally sealed off. Jung never pointed toward isolation as the goal. Human beings need each other. We regulate through relationship. We grow in relationship. We often need wisdom, comfort, and perspective from outside ourselves. The question is not whether you need people. The question is whether other people have become the only place where your certainty is allowed to exist. That is the line that has to change. Because if your inner life can never settle without an external answer, then you will remain vulnerable to every silence, every delay, every unavailable person, every ambiguous moment. Your peace will keep depending on conditions you cannot control. And that is not safety. It is a more sophisticated form of fragility. The deeper movement of this whole pattern is toward an inner place that can hold you before anyone else does. Not instead of relationship, before it. A place where you can say, I am anxious, I'm unsure, I do not know yet, and I am still here. A place where you do not immediately abandon your own perception, simply because uncertainty has entered the room. That is inner authority. Not perfect clarity, not constant confidence, the ability to remain in contact with yourself before running outward for rescue. Before we close, sit for a moment with one question. What kind of uncertainty makes you most desperate for reassurance? Is it relational uncertainty? The fear that someone is upset, withdrawing, changing? Is it moral uncertainty? The fear that you did something wrong, hurt someone, cross some invisible line? Is it decision uncertainty? The fear that one wrong move will prove you cannot trust yourself? Whatever your answer is, that is the doorway, because the place where you most urgently seek reassurance is the place where your inner authority is still most fragile. If this resonates, write in the comments one kind of question you tend to ask again and again when you are anxious, not to judge yourself, to recognize the pattern clearly. And if you know someone who seems trapped in over-checking, over-explaining, or needing constant confirmation just to feel okay, share this video with them. Because sometimes the real issue is not that they need too many answers. It is that they were never taught how to remain with themselves in the silence before an answer comes.